Hello and welcome to lecture number 6. The title of today's topic would be Life in the Roman Empire from about 100 BC to 400 AD. Essentially, we'll explore many aspects of people's daily lives, from the types of homes that they lived in and the food that they ate, whether they were rich or poor, family life as well as the importance of the father in the family, and then what people did for fun, different types of entertainment. Lastly, we'll address slavery, because slavery existed in the Roman Empire. The first aspect of Roman life will be the homes and the types of dwellings that people lived in. Wealthy individuals would tend to live in homes similar to the one that's shown here. These were single-story homes referred to as a domus. Floors might be made of marble. There could be artwork and statues like those that are depicted here. Their homes often would have a courtyard in the center or an atrium, which would be a large open space. The reason why this was quite common is that, as you see here, there's almost like a skylight with a basin at the bottom to catch rainwater so that the house could have running water within it. Here we see some additional examples of aspects of people's homes. I was lucky enough a few years ago to travel to Italy and spent time in Pompeii. This was the House of the Faun. On the left, we see the open courtyard design. On the right, we see a statue of a faun, and we see a mosaic that was very prominent within the people's homes. The Romans were very religious. Here we see a larium. This was a household shrine, kind of like an altar, that often was located at the entrance to people's homes, and you could pay homage to a god or goddess, or even deceased family members as you walked in or out of your home. Today, when you enter a person's home, you might see photos of family members. Well, they didn't have flash photography back in ancient Rome. So here we see several busts, maybe of family members or other famous individuals. The climate is quite hot in most of Italy. However, during the winter months, it might get cold. So on the left, we see a heater, and on the right, we see a lamp. Probably something like this would have some oil in it, and there would be a wick, and you could place that lamp on the corner of a room, and it could help to provide illumination. Here's another example of an oil lamp. This could hang from the center of a room, and it could help to light up a large area. Again, they didn't have electricity, so they had to provide light some way. Here we see a table and a bench. On the left, notice the 3 legs of this table and the attention to detail. Look at the claws of that bench, maybe from a lion. And on the right, we see another, and again, this is taken from ivory, and you can see the level of detail. These weren't just things that were functional, these were pieces of artwork in and of themselves. This is a bit of a controversial image, I guess you could say. As one entered the House of the Veti in Pompeii, one would have to walk past this mosaic. The caption read, "Worth its weight in gold," and he was weighing something that was very important to him. Well, I guess we'll have a bit of a transition from the House of the Veti in that image to this image of insulae. These were multi-story apartments where common people lived. The bottom level of most of these were made up of storefronts where people could buy many different items. They were just a variety of shops. The top story was the least expensive. Unlike today, where the penthouse is the best of the apartments, back then they didn't have elevators, and so people would have to walk up to the top. So as you got higher in one of these apartment buildings, the apartments themselves had a cheaper rent. There was no heat or running water in these apartments. Chamber pots often were dumped simply on the streets, so you had to watch out if you were walking near one of these apartments or these insulae. Public bathrooms with running water were available, but they were different than they are today. These public restrooms were open to both men and women at the same time. Also, notice there isn't much privacy. There aren't any barriers between the different stalls. I'm going to put in a plug for a movie that you might want to consider for the second set of movie topics for this class. It is a bit of a cheesy movie. It's a gladiator movie with a love story set with Pompeii, and its potential eruption in the background. It was released in 2014, so it's very recent, and it's not the best movie I've ever seen. However, I've been to Pompeii. I've seen it today, and so I think it does a pretty good job of depicting what the city looked like. So if you want a bit of a gladiator love story that does a decent job, it's not that bad of a film. So anyway, it's just something you might want to. So I wanted to show a few other buildings in Pompeii. On the left, you see one structure, and if you notice, it's 2 stories, and there's a bit of an overhang from the second story. This helped to provide people some shade during the summer because it gets very hot, and if it was to rain really hard, then it could also provide some shelter from the rain. On the right, we see gladiator barracks and a stadium. There was a gladiator school that was located in Pompeii, and they also had a variety of events that the public could attend. And so you can see some of that there. I was fascinated by the streets in Pompeii. Here we see some walkways where people could walk along the side of the street, but also, there are large stones in the middle. These forced people in carriages to slow down, and they also served as crosswalks. On the right, we see a row of several shops. That's in the top image, and there's also a water fountain. There were several areas where you could access fresh water. And on the bottom, you see that there's a close-up of the design or the figure located at the top of that fountain. Well, they didn't have street signs, but you could say, well, I'm located at the seahorse, or I'm located just a few doors down from the crown, or I'm located just a few doors down from a particular goddess, if that was the image at the fountain near your home. Another important location within Roman cities was the Forum. This was a large open space, generally speaking in the center of the city. Here we see the Forum in Pompeii. If there was some sort of a public celebration, it could take place there, or maybe it would just be an open space where you could go and you could talk to your neighbors or your friends, maybe sit down and have a bite to eat. And usually on either end of the Forum would be lots of different shops. The foundation of everyone's diet at ancient Rome would be bread. This was something that everyone ate on a day-to-day basis. Wealthy people could afford to have meat, and typical types of meat would be goat, lamb, chicken, really not much beef at all. Fish also was common. However, if there was a banquet, you might have exotic fish, exotic birds, rare fruit, rare vegetables. On the right, we see a group of people at a banquet. If they were to have an elaborate meal, they wouldn't sit up in their chairs. They often reclined while they ate. Again, bread would be important for poor people as well. And in the upper right-hand corner here, we see a bakery in Pompeii. Poor people also would eat a porridge. Often this was old bread, and they had hot water that was poured over the top of it, kind of like a cream of wheat or an oatmeal that we think of today. A variety of vegetables might be included in a soup, like turnips, onions, maybe even some beans. Local fruits and vegetables and nuts would be available, but they wouldn't be able to import exotic items. If they were to have meat, pork could be eaten on rare occasions. I'd like to move on now to the next topic, which would be family life. Family life was characterized by the word paterfamilia because the prefix pater means man or father. All authority in the family was held by the father. He held absolute power over the entire family, including the family slaves, their wealth, land, and even children. In fact, the father's control was so strong, when a baby was born, if it was deformed, the father could expose it to death. They practiced infanticide. While rare, it did happen upon occasion. Marriages generally were arranged. A typical age when a young woman would be ready for marriage would be 14, and for boys, it was age 20. Women held no political power. They were not allowed to vote. They also could not own property in and of themselves. Often, young women were used as pawns for political arrangements or even economic ones, as a marriage between a daughter and some other influential person meant that the two families would have some sort of an agreement. One area where women did have some authority was the education of their children. Next, I'd like to look at Romans and their religion. One thing to note, however, is we're going to look at Roman mythology and Roman religion prior to the advent of Christianity. The next lecture will focus on the history of Christianity. As was stated earlier, the Romans were very religious, and rather than simply attending religious services once a week, prayers often were recited every day on a very regular basis, and often even several times a day. This is the slide that I showed earlier, the Larium, kind of like an altar, which was located in many people's homes. As one left for work in the morning or left to go out, or as they returned home, they often would say a prayer at the family Larium. One thing that was unique about the Romans is that as they conquered different groups of people, they were very tolerant of local religions. However, there was also one thing that they expected. Anybody that they conquered had to respect Roman gods. This got many people living in Palestine in trouble with the... If you remember from an earlier presentation, followers of Judaism, or the Jewish faith, only worshipped one god. As others described it, their god was a jealous god. They were not allowed to worship other gods. This got followers of Judaism in trouble with the Romans. There was a lot of conflict between the Romans and followers of the Jewish faith. In 70 AD, the temple, the great Jewish temple in Jerusalem, was destroyed. Shortly thereafter, Jews were dispersed throughout much of the Roman Empire, beginning in 73 AD. I believe these Roman arches showing some triumphs of the Romans was shown in a previous lecture, but I wanted to point this out again because this is the Arch of Titus, located in the city of Rome, and it celebrates the so-called sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The arrow is pointing to a menorah, demonstrating that they defeated the Jewish people. The Romans were great at spreading many different ideals, including their religious views throughout the entire Mediterranean world. When it came to religion, what they did was they adopted many of the Greek gods and goddesses and simply renamed them. This was the Greek god Zeus. The Romans took this Greek god and renamed him Jupiter. Here we see the Greek goddess Hera, the wife of Zeus. The Romans renamed her Juno. If you remember, as the wife and sister of Zeus, Hera also was the goddess of marriage and childbirth. A unique tradition emerged among the Romans, particularly when 1 month was dedicated to the goddess Juno. It became very popular for young couples to get married in that month, particularly if they wanted to have blessings on their marriage and if they wanted to have many children. The tradition carries on to today, as many young people get married in the month of June. I wanted to mention one additional Greek god. This is the god Poseidon. The Romans renamed him Neptune. There are many things people do today to provide themselves with entertainment and fun. We'll look at what the Romans did next. These days, we have a range of holidays and work days in the United States. Generally speaking, people might get 2 weeks off a year, maybe 4, maybe even 6 weeks. Well, for the Romans, they had 160 to 170 holidays every single year. A typical workday today might be 8 or 9 hours. For the Romans, it was on average 6 to 7 hours. Probably the most popular form of entertainment that people undertook on their holidays was to attend chariot races, and they did so at Circus Maximus. Here we see a model of the city of Rome. Circus Maximus was a huge stadium. It had a seating capacity of 150,000. This is still even about, 40,000 more than the Big House in Ann Arbor, where the Michigan Wolverines play. Possibly one of the best depictions of what the chariot races were like were shown in the film Ben-Hur. This is several decades old. However, I will have a clip on Canvas if you want to see what the chariot races were like. Just as sports fans today might root for the Red Wings or the Tigers or maybe the Miami Heat or whatever their favorite team may be, People back then would root for different teams. Here we see the blue, white, red, and green teams of chariot racers. Possibly the most famous sports stadium ever created was the Colosseum in the city of Rome. A few years back, I was able to visit the Colosseum myself. Let me tell you, it was awesome. Really spectacular. Here you see the interior of the Colosseum. Numerous different sporting events were held here. Gladiator fights, recreation of naval battles, even military battles. Often you might see humans fighting against animals. Here you see that interior from another angle. Sometimes they would even flood the floor area, and they would bring in ships, and they would recreate famous battles from Rome's past. When the Colosseum was first dedicated, 5,000 animals fought to their death. They included elephants, lions, tigers, crocodiles, hippopotami, lynxes, apes, panthers, bears, boars, wolves, giraffes, ostriches, thrown in the ring to fight against one another to the death, and sometimes they fought against individuals. Gladiators would fight to the death. I even got my photo taken outside the Colosseum with the gladiator shown here on the right. This is an example of a small Colosseum or a smaller stadium outside of Rome. Just as today in the city of Detroit or St. Louis or Philadelphia they might have a huge sports stadium where professional athletes perform, smaller communities also have their own stadiums. The same was true back then for the Romans. The Greeks may have invented theater, but the Romans picked up on this ancient form of entertainment, and they had their own theatrical productions. Here we see a theater in the city of Pompeii. Another common form of daily entertainment took place at the public bathhouses. Individuals might pay a penny or so in order to start off at the tepidarium where the water was warm, and then they might go into the frigidarium where the water was really cold, and then they might end up in the calidarium where the water was steamy hot. On the right, we see the ruins of some ancient bathhouses. Some of these bathhouses were quite extravagant. You can see some of the details from one bathhouse located in Pompeii. In order to have a successful bathhouse, you need to have access to water. This is the Pont de Garde. The Romans were famous at constructing aqueducts. This one, located in France, was nearly 180 feet high. Here we see a side view of an aqueduct. Often these began in the mountains, where they collected the water, and then they gradually sloped down to different communities throughout the Roman Empire. Throughout the Roman Empire, you might see public bathhouses, but you could also see public fountains like these. The one on the left shows Trevi Fountain, where 3 aqueducts came together in order to provide a tremendous amount of water for the city of Rome. Lastly, I'd like to look at another segment of society, and these were slaves. Slavery existed throughout the entire Roman Empire. It's a little unclear as to exactly how many slaves there were at different time periods, but in 14 AD we do have an idea. The total population of Italy was about 7.5 million, and about 1/3 of that population, or 3 million, were enslaved. Most people became slaves if they were a prisoner of war, and most produced food in some way. There were a variety of experiences a slave might have throughout the Roman Empire. As the image on the right shows, a majority were engaged in farming. They worked on huge plantations producing wheat. Many also were gladiators. They fought to the death in many arenas throughout the empire. Some were skilled workers who had some sort of a trade and then ended up enslaved, and so they worked for their owners in a variety of capacities. Slaves experienced brutal conditions in the Roman Empire. In 73 BC, one slave named Spartacus led the largest slave rebellion in its history. He was a Greek slave who was at a gladiator school in Italy. He, along with about 200 others, tried to escape from the school, and about 75 were successful. He then began to amass a large army. It may have even had as many as 120,000 men. However, once it was so successful, the Romans drew its forces against Spartacus and his men. He was killed, and then his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, and their bodies were left to rot for months, as a reminder as to what would happen if you're a slave and you rebel against the Roman Empire. I'd like to end by reviewing some of the main ideas which were addressed in this presentation. After viewing this presentation, you should be able to write an essay that describes daily life for people living in the Roman Empire. You should be able to focus on conditions facing the rich versus the commoners or poor, men and women, as well as those who were enslaved. Topics to address would be their homes, typical food that was available, family life, and their religion, as well as what they did for entertainment and fun. Well, I hope you found this presentation interesting, and I hope you learned something new today. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.